In the autumn of 1995, Willard Psychiatric Center in upstate New York closed its doors after 126 years of operation. The building, a sprawling Victorian structure overlooking Seneca Lake, had housed thousands of patients since 1869. By the time it shut down, psychiatric care had moved elsewhere. The patients were relocated, the staff reassigned, the building left empty. Workers were hired to prepare the property for demolition. They moved through the corridors, cataloguing what remained: rusted bed frames, stacks of medical records, boxes of institutional files. On the third floor, in a locked attic that had not been opened in decades, they found something unexpected. Suitcases, hundreds of them, stacked against the walls, piled in corners, covered in dust so thick it obscured the leather. The workers opened a few and found clothing, photographs, letters, personal belongings that patients had brought with them when they were first admitted. But the patients themselves were long gone. Most had died at Willard. A few had been transferred. None had ever come back for their things. What the workers had discovered was not just luggage. They had found the abandoned lives of people who had entered Willard hoping for treatment and never left. The suitcases dated mostly from the 1910s through the 1960s, an era when psychiatric institutions functioned less as hospitals and more as permanent residences for people deemed unfit for society. Some patients had been committed for severe mental illness, others for conditions that would not be considered illnesses today: grief, poverty, epilepsy, postpartum depression. Once inside, leaving was nearly impossible. Families stopped visiting. The outside world moved on. And the patients, many of them young when they arrived, grew old within Willard's walls, their belongings stored in an attic they would never see again. The discovery of the suitcases was not widely reported at first. A few local newspapers ran brief stories. Historians took note. But for most people, the suitcases remained what they had always been: forgotten. Until a small group of researchers opened them and began piecing together the lives they contained. Among the 400 suitcases, a few stood out, not because they were more elaborate or better preserved, but because the contents told stories that were almost complete, fragments of identity left behind by people whose names had been erased from public memory. One of those suitcases belonged to a man named Dmytro Garilo. Inside were a Ukrainian Bible, worn at the edges from years of handling, photographs of a family, parents, siblings, a village somewhere in Eastern Europe, military medals from World War I, a carefully folded suit, too formal for daily wear, as if saved for an occasion that never came. The suitcase had been locked when the workers found it. When they opened it, the smell of old fabric and faded ink rose from inside, a smell that carried the weight of decades. Dmytro had arrived at Willard in 1929. He was 34 years old, an immigrant who had come to America seeking a better life. Instead, he found himself committed to an asylum for confusion and inability to work. He would spend the next 42 years inside Willard, and when he died in 1971, his suitcase remained in the attic, untouched, unclaimed, unopened, until 1995. This is not a story about one person, it is a story about hundreds. Because Dmytro's suitcase was not unique. Every suitcase in that attic represented a life interrupted, a future erased, a person who had been told they needed help, and then been abandoned to a system that offered little more than confinement. The suitcases are evidence, not of cruelty necessarily, though cruelty existed, but of something quieter and more pervasive: indifference, a system that admitted people and then forgot them, families that stopped visiting and then stopped calling, a society that decided certain lives were not worth the effort to save, and when those people died, their belongings were stored in an attic, out of sight, out of mind, until the building itself was no longer useful. This is the story of Willard, and the suitcases that revealed what was left behind. Dmytro Gavrilo was born in 1895 in a small village in what is now Ukraine. He grew up during a time of upheaval, wars, borders shifting, empires collapsing. When World War I began, he was conscripted into the Russian Imperial Army. He fought, he survived, and when the war ended, he carried its scars with him. In 1920, like millions of others, Dmytro immigrated to the United States. He arrived at Ellis Island with a single trunk, a few personal belongings, and the hope that America would offer stability his homeland could not. He settled in upstate New York, near Syracuse. He found work in a factory. He attended a Ukrainian Orthodox church. He kept to himself, but he was known as reliable, someone who showed up on time, who did what was asked. But something was wrong. His co-workers noticed that he sometimes stopped mid-task, staring at nothing, as if listening to something they couldn't hear. He spoke about the war occasionally, not in detail, but in fragments. Faces he remembered, sounds that still woke him at night. What Dmytro was experiencing would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. But in 1929, there was no such diagnosis. There was only confusion, inability to function, mental disturbance. And when those terms were written on the commitment form signed by a local doctor, Dmytro's future was decided. He arrived at Willard Psychiatric Center in March 1929. The intake form listed his symptoms: disoriented, talks about the war, difficulty maintaining employment, no immediate family in the United States. That last line was critical, because patients with family who advocated for them sometimes got out. Patients without family did not. Dmytro was 34 years old when he entered Willard. He brought with him everything he owned, the suitcase that would later be found in the attic. He believed he was going to a hospital, that he would receive treatment, that he would leave. He did not understand that Willard was not designed for people to leave. The first weeks at Willard were disorienting. Dmytro was assigned to a ward with 40 other men. The room was long and narrow, lined with beds so close together there was barely space to walk between them. The routine was simple: wake, eat, work, eat, sleep. Repeat. Some patients were assigned to labor, tending the gardens, working in the laundry, maintaining the grounds. Dmytro, because of his factory experience, was placed in the workshop, repairing furniture and tools. The work was not difficult, but it was endless, and it was unpaid. Willard, like many state hospitals of the era, functioned on patient labor. The institution saved money by using patients to maintain the facility. In exchange, patients received food, shelter, and the promise of care that rarely materialized. Dmytro did the work quietly. He followed the rules. He caused no trouble, and that ironically worked against him, because patients who caused problems were sometimes deemed improved and released. Patients who adapted, who became compliant, who fit into the system, were seen as institutionalized, and institutionalized patients were rarely discharged. Dmytro wrote letters. He wrote to the church he had attended in Syracuse. He wrote to former co-workers. He wrote to a cousin in Pennsylvania he had met only once. The letters were polite and restrained. He did not complain. He did not demand. He simply asked if they knew when he might be able to leave. Most of his letters went unanswered. The few responses he received were brief. "We hope you are well. We will pray for you. We are sure the doctors know best." No one came to visit, not because they were cruel, but because visiting required time, money, and the willingness to step inside a place most people preferred to forget existed. By 1935, Dmytro stopped writing letters. The years blurred together, the same meals, the same routine, the same faces aging beside him. Dmytro's hair turned gray. His hands, once steady from factory work, developed a tremor. His English, which had improved steadily before his admission, began to fade, not from illness but from disuse. He spoke Ukrainian to himself sometimes, quietly, as if trying to remember who he had been before Willard. Other patients came and went. Some were transferred. A few were released. Most died. Dmytro remained. Not because his condition worsened. His medical records from the 1940s and 50s describe him as stable, cooperative, no acute symptoms. He remained because there was nowhere else for him to go. No family to claim him, no advocate to argue for his release, no reason for the institution to spend time and resources processing his discharge. He had become, in the language of the system, chronic, and chronic patients stayed. In 1971, Dmytro Gaurelo died at Willard. He was 76 years old. He had lived at the institution for 42 years, more than half his life. His death certificate listed the cause as natural causes. His body was buried in the Willard Cemetery, a plot of land behind the main building where hundreds of patients were interred, most with only a number marking their graves. His suitcase remained in the attic, where it had been placed decades earlier when storage space in the wards ran low. Inside were the things he had brought with him in 1929, the Bible, the photographs, the medals, the suit, objects that had once represented a life. Now they were simply remnants, evidence that Dmytro Gaurelo had existed, and that he had been forgotten. Among the suitcases in Willard's attic, one stood out for what it did not contain. It belonged to a woman named Anna Agnew, admitted in 1917 at the age of 29. Her suitcase held a single dress, neatly folded, a hairbrush with a few strands of dark hair still caught in the bristles, a small photograph of a baby, that was all. No letters, no mementos, no personal effects beyond the essentials, as if she had packed in haste, or as if she had been told she would not be gone long. Anna's commitment form listed her diagnosis as melancholy following childbirth. What that meant in 1917 was postpartum depression, but the term did not exist yet, and the treatment, if it could be called that, was institutionalization. Anna would spend the rest of her life at Willard. 55 years. She would never see her child again. Anna had been a school teacher before her marriage. She lived in Rochester, New York, with her husband, a clerk at a law firm, and they had what her family later described as a quiet, respectable life. When Anna became pregnant in 1916, the pregnancy was difficult. She was sick for months. The birth, when it came, was long and exhausting. The baby, a girl, was healthy. But Anna was not. In the weeks after the birth, she stopped eating. She stopped sleeping. She would sit by the window for hours, staring out at nothing, unresponsive when her husband spoke to her. Her family called a doctor. The doctor recommended rest. But when rest did not help, he recommended something else. Temporary commitment to a state hospital, where she could recover under medical supervision. The word temporary was crucial, because everyone believed, Anna, her husband, her family, that this was a short-term solution. A few weeks, maybe a few months, and she would return home. That is not what happened. Anna arrived at Willard in April 1917. The intake notes describe her as withdrawn, unresponsive, exhibiting signs of melancholia. She was placed in a women's ward on the second floor. The room held 30 women, most of them middle-aged or elderly, most of them diagnosed with vague conditions, hysteria, nervous exhaustion, moral insanity. Anna was the youngest. At first she asked when she could go home. The nurses told her the doctors would decide. She asked to see her baby. She was told that visits were not permitted until she showed improvement. She tried to improve. She followed the rules. She participated in the limited activities, sewing, light housework, supervised walks in the courtyard. But improvement, at Willard, was not measured by recovery. It was measured by compliance. And compliant patients, once institutionalized, were rarely discharged. Anna's husband visited twice in the first year. The visits were brief, supervised, formal. They sat across from each other in a visiting room, speaking in low voices while a nurse stood nearby. Anna asked about the baby. Her husband said she was healthy, growing, being cared for by Anna's sister. Anna asked when she could come home. Her husband said the doctors thought it was best if she stayed a little longer. On his second visit, he brought divorce papers. He did not phrase it cruelly. He explained that he needed to move forward, that the baby needed stability, that Anna's absence had made it impossible to maintain their household. Anna signed the papers without protest, not because she agreed, but because protest, she had learned, only made things worse. After that, her husband did not visit again. The baby, Anna's daughter, was raised by Anna's sister in Buffalo. The child was told that her mother had died shortly after childbirth. It was easier that way, simpler, less shameful. And by the time the child was old enough to ask questions, the family had moved on. The story had solidified into accepted fact. Anna's daughter grew up, married, had children of her own. She lived her entire life believing her mother was dead. She was not dead. She was 70 miles away, living in a state hospital, never knowing that her daughter existed. Not because she had forgotten, but because no one ever told her what had happened after the divorce. Anna adapted to life at Willard the way many long-term patients did. By withdrawing. She stopped asking questions. She stopped expressing emotion. She moved through the routines mechanically, waking, eating, working, sleeping. Her medical records from the 1930s describe her as stable but uncommunicative. By the 1940s, chronic, no acute symptoms. By the 1950s, institutionalized. The language shifted over the decades, but the meaning remained the same. Anna was not getting worse. She was simply not getting better. And in a system designed for management rather than recovery, that was enough reason to keep her. Anna Agnew died at Willard in 1972. She was 84 years old. She had spent 55 years inside the institution, nearly twice as long as she had lived before it. Her death certificate listed the cause as pneumonia. She was buried in the Willard Cemetery, in an unmarked grave. Her suitcase remained in the attic. Inside was the photograph of the baby, her daughter, now in her 50s, still unaware that her mother had lived into old age only miles away. The photograph would not be discovered until 1995. By then, Anna's daughter was also dead. And the truth, that mother and daughter had spent their entire lives separated by a system that had decided Anna was unfit to leave, remained buried with them. Anna's story is not unique at Willard. Dozens of women were committed for melancholy, hysteria, moral insanity, diagnoses that had more to do with social expectations than medical conditions, women who grieved too long after a death, women who resisted their families, women who became inconvenient. Once inside, they were forgotten. Not because they were dangerous, not because they were violent, but because they were women in a system that had decided their value was less than the cost of caring for them. And that decision, once made, was rarely reversed. Willard Psychiatric Center was not designed to be cruel. It was designed to be efficient. And efficiency, in the context of a state institution operating on limited funding, meant processing as many patients as possible with as few resources as necessary. The result was not intentional brutality. It was systematic neglect disguised as care. When Willard opened in 1869, it was presented as a progressive reform, a place where people with mental illness could receive humane treatment away from the chaos of city almshouses. The facility was built on 800 acres of farmland overlooking Seneca Lake. The architecture was intended to be therapeutic: high ceilings, large windows, open spaces. The early philosophy was optimistic. Doctors believed that with proper rest, routine, and a calm environment, many patients would recover and return home. But optimism is expensive, and as New York's population grew, so did the number of people committed to state care. By 1900, Willard was overcrowded. By 1920, it was operating at nearly double its intended capacity. The therapeutic ideals gave way to something simpler: warehousing. Admission to Willard was supposed to be temporary. But in practice, discharge was rare. The process required multiple steps: a doctor's recommendation, family willing to take the patient back, proof that the patient could function independently. For patients like Dimitro, with no family in the United States, discharge was nearly impossible. For patients like Anna, whose families had moved on, it was never even considered. And for patients who had been inside for more than a few years, institutionalization itself became a barrier to release. They had forgotten how to navigate the outside world. They had lost the social connections that might have helped them reintegrate. They had become, in the language of the system, chronic, a term that meant not incurable, but unlikely to leave. Daily life at Willard was governed by routine. Patients woke at 6 a.m. Breakfast was served in a large dining hall: oatmeal, bread, coffee. Then work assignments. Some patients tended the gardens, others worked in the laundry or kitchen, some maintained the grounds. The work was framed as therapeutic. Occupational therapy, the staff called it. But it was also economic. Patient labor kept Willard running. The institution grew its own food, washed its own linens, repaired its own buildings, all using unpaid patient labor. Some patients welcomed the work. It gave structure to their days. It made them feel useful. Others resented it. They understood they were being used. But resentment, at Willard, was noted as a symptom of mental illness. If you accepted your situation, you were compliant. And compliance meant you were institutionalized. If you resisted, you were uncooperative. And resistance meant you needed more treatment. Either way, you stayed. Medical treatment at Willard evolved over the decades, but it was never the institution's primary function. In the early years, treatment consisted mostly of rest, routine, and supervision. By the 1930s, doctors experimented with new methods: hydrotherapy, cold baths, insulin shock therapy, fever therapy. In the 1940s and 50s, lobotomies and electroconvulsive therapy became common. These treatments were not sadistic. They were considered cutting-edge. Doctors genuinely believed they were helping. But the results were inconsistent. Some patients improved. Many did not. And some were left worse than before, their memories damaged, their personalities altered, their capacity for independent thought diminished. Dimitro was never subjected to these treatments. His records describe him as stable, and stable patients were generally left alone. Anna underwent electroconvulsive therapy in 1943. The records note that it produced no significant change in her condition. She was not given further treatment. She was simply returned to her ward and added to the list of chronic patients who required supervision but not active intervention. The staff at Willard were not villains. Most were underpaid, overworked, and overwhelmed by the sheer number of patients they were expected to manage. A single nurse might be responsible for 40 patients. A doctor might see 100 in a week, brief consultations, hurried notes, no time for meaningful engagement. The system did not reward care. It rewarded compliance. A ward where patients were quiet and orderly was considered well run. A ward where patients asked questions or expressed distress was considered problematic. And so the staff learned, often unconsciously, to prioritize order over recovery. Patients who adapted were left alone. Patients who struggled were sedated. And patients who had been inside for decades, who no longer remembered what life outside felt like, were simply maintained, fed, housed, supervised, but not treated, not rehabilitated, not prepared for discharge. Because discharge was not the goal was management. And Willard, for all its failures, was very good at managing. By the 1960s, Willard held over 4,000 patients. The wards were crowded. The hallways smelled of disinfectant and stale air. The dining halls were loud, chaotic, institutional, but the institution itself was efficient. Meals were served on time, laundry was clean, the grounds were well maintained. From the outside, Willard looked functional. From the inside, it was a place where time stopped. Patients aged, seasons changed, decades passed. But the routine remained the same. And for those who had been there long enough, the routine was all they had left. Dimitro stopped counting years sometime in the 1940s. He still worked in the workshop, he still attended meals, he still followed the schedule, but he no longer thought about leaving. He no longer imagined a future beyond Willard's walls. He had adapted. And adaptation, in a place like this, was a kind of surrender. Anna stopped asking about her daughter, sometime in the 1930s, not because she forgot, but because asking brought pain, and pain served no purpose. She learned to live in the present, a narrow, repetitive present that demanded nothing and offered nothing. She had become what the system wanted, quiet, compliant, invisible. And in becoming invisible, she had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. She was still alive, but she was no longer living. This was the machine, not designed for cruelty, designed for efficiency. And in its efficiency, it erased thousands of lives, not by killing them, but by forgetting them, by storing their suitcases in an attic and moving on. Not every patient who entered Willard stayed for decades. Some were discharged after months or years. A few adapted to life outside. Others returned, unable to manage without the structure the institution provided. And a small number left changed, not cured, but fundamentally altered by what they had experienced inside. One of those patients was Lawrence Marek. His suitcase told a different kind of story. Lawrence was 21 years old when he was admitted to Willard in 1954. Inside his suitcase, workers found a tenor saxophone, carefully wrapped in cloth, sheet music, jazz standards, handwritten compositions, a photograph of Lawrence on stage, mid-performance, smiling, a letter from a band leader offering him a gig in New York City. The letter was dated 2 weeks before his admission. Lawrence had been a musician, and by all accounts, a talented one. But in the spring of 1954, something had broken inside him. Lawrence grew up in Buffalo, New York. His father worked in a steel mill. His mother cleaned houses. They were not wealthy, but they were stable. Lawrence discovered music in high school. He taught himself saxophone, practicing for hours in the basement until his neighbors complained about the noise. By 18, he was good enough to play in local clubs. By 20, he was performing regularly. Small venues, late nights, modest pay. But it was work he loved. He had dreams of moving to New York City, of joining a real band, of making music his life. And then, in March 1954, he had what his family described as a nervous breakdown. The details are vague. Lawrence's medical records describe episodes of paranoia and auditory disturbance. His family said he began hearing things, voices, music that wasn't there. He stopped sleeping. He became convinced that people were watching him, following him. A doctor diagnosed him with schizophrenia. In 1954, that diagnosis was a sentence, because schizophrenia was considered incurable, and patients diagnosed with it were rarely expected to recover. Lawrence was committed to Willard for observation and treatment. His family believed it would be temporary, a few months, maybe a year, until the doctors figured out what was wrong and fixed it. Lawrence brought his saxophone. He told his mother he would keep practicing, that when he got out, he would still have the gig in New York. His mother didn't have the heart to tell him she had already called the band leader and said he wouldn't be coming. Lawrence's first weeks at Willard were disorienting. He was placed in a ward with men twice his age, chronic patients who had been institutionalized for years. They moved slowly, spoke little, and showed no interest in the young man with the saxophone case. Lawrence tried to practice. He took the instrument to a quiet corner of the day room and played softly, jazz standards, improvised melodies, anything to remind himself that he was still a musician. But the staff told him to stop. The noise, they said, disturbed the other patients. Lawrence asked if there was somewhere else he could play. They said no. He asked if he could at least keep the saxophone in his room. They said personal items had to be stored. His saxophone was taken to the attic. He would never see it again. The treatment Lawrence received was typical for the era. He was given chlorpromazine, a new antipsychotic drug that had been introduced in the early 1950s. It reduced his symptoms, but it also dulled him. His thoughts slowed. His movements became sluggish. The sharpness that had made him a good improviser, the ability to think quickly, to react in the moment, faded. He also underwent electroconvulsive therapy. 6 sessions over 3 months. The doctors said it would help. The records note that it reduced agitation. But it also damaged his memory. He forgot pieces of his childhood. He forgot the names of people he had played with. He forgot entire performances. And when he tried to remember the music, the melodies he had written, the compositions he had been working on, he found only fragments, pieces that no longer connected. Lawrence was discharged in 1956 after 2 years at Willard. His parents came to pick him up. They brought him home to Buffalo and tried to help him readjust. But the person who returned was not the person who had left. He was quieter, slower. He struggled to follow conversations. He had difficulty concentrating. He tried to play music again. He borrowed a saxophone from a friend and sat in his basement, the same place he had practiced as a teenager. But his hands no longer moved the way they once had. The medication made them shake, and the music that had once come naturally now felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. After a few weeks, he stopped trying. Lawrence lived with his parents for the next decade. He worked occasional jobs, dishwasher, stock clerk, janitor, nothing that required much thought or interaction. He took his medication, he attended follow-up appointments, he did what he was told. But he never played music again. In 1967, he was readmitted to Willard after what the records describe as a relapse. He stayed for another 3 years. When he was discharged in 1970, he moved into a group home in Rochester. He lived there until his death in 1989. He was 56 years old. Lawrence's suitcase remained in the attic for 41 years. When workers found it in 1995, the saxophone was still inside, tarnished, the pads dried out, unplayable. But it was there, waiting, as if Lawrence might someday come back for it. Lawrence's story is different from Dimitro's and Anna's. He was not forgotten. He left. He survived. But survival, in his case, came at a cost. The treatment that reduced his symptoms also reduced him. The institution that was supposed to help him instead took the thing that had made him who he was, his music, his sharpness, his future, and replaced it with stability. He lived, but he did not thrive, and the saxophone in the attic became a symbol of everything he had lost, not to cruelty, not to neglect, but to a system that believed compliance was more important than identity, and that saving a life meant accepting that the person might never fully return. The suitcases in Willard's attic represented more than individual tragedies. They represented a pattern, a system that admitted people and then forgot them, families that stopped visiting and then stopped remembering, a society that decided certain lives were not worth the effort to save. And when those people died, their belongings were stored away, out of sight, out of mind, until the building itself was no longer useful. Between 1869 and 1995, more than 50,000 people were admitted to Willard. Most stayed for months or years. Many stayed for decades. Some died there. The reasons for commitment varied wildly. Medical, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, epilepsy, considered a mental illness until the 1960s, dementia, brain injuries, neurological conditions, social, poverty, families unable to care for disabled or elderly relatives, moral insanity, a vague term used for women who defied social norms, alcoholism, addiction, postpartum depression, grief, hysteria, administrative, people who had nowhere else to go, immigrants with no family support, elderly people with no caregivers, people transferred from prisons or almshouses. The common thread was not mental illness. It was inconvenience. These were people society did not know what to do with, and Willard, along with dozens of institutions like it, became the default solution. The suitcases revealed patterns in the belongings patients brought with them. Young women often brought wedding dresses, saved for marriages that never happened, baby clothes for children taken away or never raised, photographs of families they would never see again. Immigrants brought religious texts in their native languages, photographs of villages and relatives left behind, documents proving their identities, passports, work permits, military records young men brought, musical instruments, saxophones, harmonicas, violins, sports equipment, baseballs, boxing gloves, tools and trade implements, suggesting careers interrupted. Elderly patients brought Bibles, rosaries, prayer books, family heirlooms, pocket watches, jewelry, keepsakes, letters from children who would never visit again. Each suitcase told a story of a life interrupted, a future cancelled, a person who had hoped, at least initially, that they would return home. The families of Willard patients faced impossible choices. Caring for someone with severe mental illness in the early 1900s required resources most families did not have. There were no medications, no outpatient programs, no community support systems. When a family member became too difficult to manage, violent, suicidal, unable to care for themselves, institutionalization was often the only option. But once someone was admitted, visiting was difficult. Willard was remote. Travel was expensive, and the stigma of having a family member in a lunatic asylum was profound. Some families visited regularly, especially in the first year. But as time passed, visits became less frequent. Children grew up and moved away. Parents aged and could no longer make the trip. Siblings started their own families and had their own responsibilities. And eventually, many families simply stopped coming. Not because they were cruel, but because maintaining a connection with someone who might never leave was emotionally and financially unsustainable. The letters found in some suitcases reveal this gradual abandonment. One patient received weekly letters from her sister for the first 2 years, then monthly letters for another year, then occasional cards at Christmas. Then nothing. Another patient kept every letter his mother sent, 47 in total, spanning 6 years. The letters grew shorter over time. The last one, dated 1938, said simply, "We think of you always. We hope you are well." There were no more letters after that. His mother had died, but no one informed him. He continued waiting for letters that would never come. By the 1960s, Willard's population had swelled to over 4,000 patients. The institution was overcrowded, underfunded, and overwhelmed. The idealistic vision of therapeutic care had long since collapsed under the weight of numbers. Most patients received minimal treatment. They were housed, fed, supervised, but not healed. The staff did what they could with the resources they had. But those resources were never enough. And so Willard became what it had always been destined to become: a warehouse for people society had decided were too difficult, too expensive, or too inconvenient to care for. The civil rights movements of the 1960s and 70s eventually changed psychiatric care in America. Activists exposed the conditions in state hospitals. Courts ruled that patients had rights. New medications made outpatient treatment possible. The policy of deinstitutionalization began, closing large state hospitals and moving patients into community-based care. Willard began to shrink. By 1980, the population had dropped to under 1,000. By 1990, it was fewer than 200. And in 1995, the state of New York decided to close Willard permanently. The remaining patients were transferred to other facilities or group homes. The staff were reassigned, the buildings were emptied, and the suitcases, the belongings of people who had entered decades earlier and never left, were discovered in the attic. Of the 400 suitcases found, most belonged to patients who had died at Willard. A few belonged to patients who had been discharged but never returned for their belongings, and a small number belonged to patients whose families had never been notified of their admission: immigrants, homeless individuals, people who had arrived through the prison or almshouse system and simply disappeared into the institution. For these patients, the suitcases were the only proof they had ever existed. No graves with names, no records of discharge, no family searching for them. Just a suitcase in an attic, waiting to be found. When the suitcases were first discovered in 1995, they were treated as historical artifacts. Interesting, but not urgent. The workers who found them reported the discovery to the New York State Office of Mental Health. A few items were photographed, a brief memo was written, and then the suitcases were packed up and moved to a storage facility. For 5 years, they sat in boxes, untouched, until 2000, when a group of historians and photographers, Darby Penny and Peter Stastny, learned about them and asked permission to examine them. What they found stunned them. The suitcases were not just artifacts, they were windows into lives that had been erased. Each one contained fragments of identity: photographs, letters, clothing, personal items. Together they formed a collective portrait of the people who had been admitted to Willard over decades. Penny and Stastny began the painstaking work of documenting each suitcase. They photographed the contents. They researched the names on the luggage tags. They searched through Willard's records to find admission dates, diagnoses, discharge information. What they discovered was both tragic and revealing. Many of the patients whose suitcases were found had been admitted for conditions that would not be considered mental illnesses today. One woman, committed in 1927 for melancholy, had been grieving the death of her child. A man, admitted in 1933 for inability to work, had epilepsy. Another woman, committed in 1945 for hysteria, had been experiencing symptoms of what would now be recognized as postpartum depression. These were not people who needed long-term institutionalization. They were people who needed support, understanding, and temporary care. But once inside Willard, they were trapped by a system that had no clear path to discharge. The contents of the suitcases revealed the hopes patients had brought with them. One woman had packed 3 dresses, one for everyday wear, one for church, one for special occasions, as if she expected to have a social life inside the hospital. A man had brought a full set of carpentry tools, as if he believed he would continue his trade. Another woman had packed a wedding dress. She had been engaged when she was admitted. Her fiancé never came to visit. The wedding never happened. These were not people who expected to stay. They were people who believed they would return home, and the fact that their belongings remained in the attic, decades after their deaths, was proof that they never did. Penny and Stastny spent years researching the lives behind the suitcases. They interviewed former staff members who remembered some of the patients. They contacted families when they could be found. They pieced together stories from fragments. In 2008, they published their findings in a book, The Lives They Left Behind, Suitcases from a State Hospital Attic. The book was not just a catalogue of belongings. It was an attempt to restore identity to people who had been reduced to case numbers and diagnoses, to say their names, to tell their stories, to acknowledge that they had existed as full human beings, not just patients, not just case files, but people with dreams, families, and futures that had been stolen from them. The publication of the book sparked renewed interest in Willard's history. A museum was established at the site, dedicated to telling the story of the institution and the people who had lived there. The suitcases were put on display, not all 400, but a selection that represented the diversity of patients and the range of belongings they had brought. Visitors walked through the exhibit slowly, quietly. Many stopped to read the cards beside each suitcase, brief biographies of the people who had owned them. Some visitors wept. Others stood in silence. A few left notes, apologies, acknowledgements. The suitcases had become a memorial, not just to the patients of Willard, but to everyone who had been forgotten by systems designed to care for them. For some families, the discovery of the suitcases brought closure. A woman in her 70s learned that her grandmother, who had disappeared when the woman was a child, had spent 40 years at Willard. The family had been told she died shortly after being sent away for treatment. She had not died. She had simply been forgotten. The woman was able to visit the museum, see her grandmother's suitcase, and finally understand what had happened. Other families were not so fortunate. Many of the patients whose suitcases were found had no living relatives. Their names meant nothing to anyone. And so, the suitcases stood as the only testimony to their existence. The discovery of the suitcases also raised uncomfortable questions about contemporary psychiatric care. Because while Willard had closed, the problems it represented had not disappeared. People with severe mental illness still struggled to access care. Families still faced impossible choices, and society still had a tendency to forget people it found inconvenient. The forms had changed, the language had evolved, but the patterns persisted. And the suitcases, those 400 forgotten lives, served as a reminder of what happens when care becomes warehousing, when treatment becomes management, and when people are reduced to problems to be stored away. In 2010, one of the suitcases was opened at a public event. It had belonged to a man named Frank, admitted in 1947. Inside was a harmonica, a notebook filled with handwritten poems, and a photograph of Frank with a woman. His wife, presumably, though the records did not say. The poems were simple, heartfelt. One read, "I dream of home, of fields and sky, of days when I was free. But here I wait and wonder why no one remembers me." Frank had died at Willard in 1968. He was 54 years old. His suitcase had waited in the attic for 27 years before being found. And when the poem was read aloud at the event, the room fell silent. Because Frank's question, "Why does no one remember me?" was not just his question. It was the question of every person whose suitcase sat in that attic. And it was a question that, even decades later, had no good answer. By the early 1990s, Willard Psychiatric Center was a shadow of what it had once been. The population had dwindled to fewer than 200 patients. The sprawling Victorian buildings, designed to house thousands, sat mostly empty. The wards that had once buzzed with activity were silent. The philosophy of care had changed. Deinstitutionalization, the movement to close large state hospitals and provide community-based treatment, had become national policy. Willard, like many institutions of its era, was being phased out. In 1995, the state of New York made the decision official. Willard would close permanently. The closure was not sudden. It was a gradual process, carried out over months. Patients were evaluated. Some were transferred to smaller psychiatric facilities. Others were placed in group homes or assisted living arrangements. A few, those deemed stable enough, were discharged outright. The staff helped patients pack their belongings. They arranged transportation. They tried to ease the transition. But for many long-term patients, leaving Willard was terrifying. Some had been institutionalized for so long they could not remember life outside. The routines of the hospital, the meals, the schedules, the structure, were all they knew. One patient, who had lived at Willard for 30 years, refused to leave his ward. He sat on his bed, clutching a pillow, and said simply, "This is my home. Where else would I go?" He was eventually moved to a group home in Syracuse. He died 6 months later. The staff said he never adjusted. The closure of Willard was framed as progress. Smaller facilities were supposed to be more humane. Community-based care was supposed to provide better outcomes, and for some patients this was true. Those who were transferred to well-staffed group homes or who had family support often did better in less institutional settings. But for others, the closure was simply another form of abandonment. Because the community-based care that was promised did not always materialize. Group homes were underfunded. Outpatient programs had waiting lists. Many patients ended up homeless, cycling through emergency rooms and short-term shelters with no stable place to live. The closure of large institutions did not eliminate the need for long-term psychiatric care. It simply shifted the burden from the state to communities that were not prepared to handle it. And so the cycle continued, just in a different form. When the last patient left Willard in December 1995, the staff held a small ceremony. They gathered in the main hall where decades earlier patients had attended dances, watched movies, and celebrated holidays. A chaplain said a prayer. A former superintendent gave a brief speech about the institution's history. But the tone was not celebratory. It was somber, because everyone understood that Willard's closure was not just the end of a building. It was the end of an era that had begun with optimism and ended in recognition of failure. The staff who had worked there for decades knew the truth. Willard had helped some people, but it had failed many more. And the closure, while necessary, did not erase that failure. It simply closed the door on it. After the patients and staff left, the buildings were emptied. Furniture was removed. Medical equipment was salvaged. Files were boxed and sent to state archives. And in the process, workers discovered the suitcases. 400 of them, stacked in an attic that had not been opened in decades. The discovery was reported. Photographs were taken. A few suitcases were opened to see what was inside. And then, for 5 years, they were forgotten again, stored in a warehouse, waiting for someone to recognize their significance. The physical site of Willard did not remain empty for long. In 1996, the New York State Department of Corrections opened a medium-security prison on part of the property. The irony was not lost on historians. A place that had once housed people deemed mentally ill was now housing people deemed criminal. The functions were different, but the underlying logic was the same, removing people from society who were considered too difficult, too dangerous, or too expensive to manage in any other way. Some of Willard's buildings were preserved. The main administrative building was converted into a museum, dedicated to telling the story of the institution and the people who had lived there. The museum opened in 2010, 15 years after the closure. It was small, modest, underfunded, but it served an important function. It ensured that Willard's history and the people who had been forgotten inside it would not be erased entirely. The suitcases became the centerpiece of the museum's permanent exhibit. Visitors could see them, read about the people who had owned them, and reflect on what their presence in an attic said about how society treats its most vulnerable. For some former staff members, the closure of Willard brought relief. They had spent years working in an overcrowded, underfunded system. They had tried to provide care with inadequate resources. They had watched patients languish for decades because there was nowhere else for them to go. Closing the institution meant those conditions would no longer exist, at least not in that form. But relief was mixed with guilt, because many staff members knew that the patients they had cared for, people like Dimitro, Anna, Lawrence, had not received the help they needed. Not because the staff didn't care, but because the system made real care impossible. One nurse, who had worked at Willard for 25 years, said in an interview, "We did what we could, but what we could was never enough, and that's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life." The closure of Willard marked the end of an era in American psychiatric care. But it was not a clean ending. The problems Willard represented, lack of resources, societal indifference, the tendency to forget people once they are removed from view, did not disappear. They simply moved into prisons, into homeless shelters, into emergency rooms that cycle people through without addressing underlying needs. The form changed, the substance remained, and the suitcases, those 400 forgotten lives, stood as a reminder of what happens when care becomes warehousing, when institutions prioritize efficiency over humanity, and when society decides certain people are easier to forget than to help. In 2004, nearly a decade after the suitcases were discovered, a traveling exhibition was organized. It was called The Lives They Left Behind, and it featured a selection of the suitcases along with the stories of the people who had owned them. The exhibition opened at the Sculpture Center in New York City, then traveled to museums, universities, and community centers across the United States. Wherever it appeared, it drew crowds. People came to see the suitcases. They stayed because of the stories. The exhibition was designed to be immersive. Each suitcase was displayed in a glass case, open so visitors could see the contents. Beside each one was a placard with the patient's name, their admission date, their diagnosis, and a brief biography pieced together from medical records and personal belongings. The lighting was dim, the music somber. The space felt reverent, more like a memorial than a museum exhibit. Visitors moved slowly through the room, pausing at each suitcase, reading the stories, looking at the objects inside. Many visitors wept. Others stood in silence, processing what they were seeing. Because the suitcases were not just artifacts, they were evidence of lives that had been lived and then forgotten. The exhibition sparked conversations about psychiatric care, institutional neglect, and the treatment of vulnerable populations. Mental health advocates used it as a teaching tool, pointing to Willard as an example of what happens when care systems fail. Historians used it to contextualize the broader history of American psychiatry, the shift from moral treatment to warehousing to deinstitutionalization. And families, some of whom had relatives who had been institutionalized, used it as a way to process their own histories. Because Willard was not unique. Institutions like it had existed in every state, and millions of people had passed through them. The suitcases represented not just the patients of Willard, but the forgotten people of an entire system. One of the most powerful aspects of the exhibition was the letters. Many of the suitcases contained correspondence, letters from family members, friends, former employers. The exhibition included excerpts from some of these letters displayed on the walls. One letter, written in 1932 by a mother to her daughter at Willard, read, "Dearest Mary, we think of you every day. Your father asks about you often. We hope the doctors are treating you well. We will visit as soon as we are able. Please know that you are loved." There was no record of the family ever visiting. Mary died at Willard in 1958, 26 years after that letter was written. Another letter, written in 1941 by a man named Thomas to his wife at Willard, read, "My darling, I miss you terribly. The house is empty without you. I am working hard to save money so that I can bring you home. Please hold on. I will come for you." Thomas never came. His wife remained at Willard until her death in 1973. The records do not say what happened to Thomas, but the letter, carefully folded and placed in his wife's suitcase, suggested that she had kept it and kept hoping for decades. The exhibition also included video interviews with former Willard staff and with family members of patients. One interview featured a woman whose grandmother had been a patient at Willard in the 1940s. The woman had been told as a child that her grandmother died shortly after being sent away for treatment. It was only after the suitcases were discovered that she learned the truth. Her grandmother had lived at Willard for 30 years. The woman visited the museum, saw her grandmother's suitcase, and broke down. She was alive all that time, the woman said through tears. And we didn't know. We were told she was dead. How could they just forget her? The exhibition curator had no answer, because there was no good answer. The exhibition also raised difficult questions about memory and responsibility. Should families have done more to stay connected with institutionalized relatives? Should the state have done more to facilitate discharge? Should society have created better alternatives to long-term institutionalization? The answer to all of these questions was yes, but assigning blame was less important than acknowledging what had happened and ensuring it did not happen again. By the time the exhibition ended its tour in 2008, it had been seen by over 100,000 people. It generated media coverage, academic papers, and public discussions about mental health care. And it ensured that the people whose suitcases had been found, people like Dimitro, Anna, Lawrence, and hundreds of others, would not be forgotten again. Their names would be remembered, their stories would be told, and their belongings, those fragments of interrupted lives, would serve as a reminder of what was lost when society chose to look away. One visitor to the exhibition left a note in the guest book. It read, "I came here thinking this was about history, but it's not. It's about us, about what we're still doing, about who we're still forgetting. Thank you for making me see that." That, perhaps, was the exhibition's greatest achievement, not just telling the stories of the past, but forcing people to ask, what are we doing now? The buildings of Willard still stand. Some have been converted. The administrative building is now a museum. Part of the property is a prison. A few structures house state offices. Others sit empty, their windows broken, their walls crumbling, slowly being reclaimed by the landscape. But the place itself carries a weight that no renovation can erase. Visitors who walk the grounds describe the same feeling, a heaviness in the air, a silence that feels deliberate, as if the walls themselves remember what happened here. You can repurpose a building, but you cannot erase its history. The legacy of Willard is not just about one institution. It is about a system, a way of thinking about mental illness, about care, about who deserves help and who can be forgotten. That system has changed, but the patterns it created persist. Today, the United States has closed most of its large psychiatric institutions. Deinstitutionalization, which began in the 1960s, was supposed to replace warehousing with community-based care, and in some ways, it succeeded. Medications improved. Outpatient programs expanded. The horrors of overcrowded wards and decades-long institutionalization became less common. But the promise of community-based care was never fully realized. Funding for mental health services was inadequate. Group homes were scarce. Families were left to navigate complex systems with little support. And so the people who once would have been sent to places like Willard ended up elsewhere, in prisons. The largest psychiatric facilities in America are now jails and prisons where inmates with mental illness receive minimal treatment. On the streets, homelessness and untreated mental illness are deeply intertwined. Many people who would have been institutionalized a generation ago now cycle through shelters and emergency rooms, in crisis. Without long-term support, people with severe mental illness often deteriorate until they reach a breaking point, requiring hospitalization, incarceration, or worse. The form has changed. The names have changed. But the underlying problem, a society that does not adequately care for its most vulnerable, remains. The Suitcases of Willard force uncomfortable questions. How do we decide who deserves care? What happens when care systems are underfunded, overwhelmed, or designed for management rather than recovery? And what responsibility do we have to people who cannot advocate for themselves? These are not historical questions. They are present tense questions. Because every day people with mental illness struggle to access care. Families make impossible choices. and society continues to find ways to look away. The story of Dimitro, Anna, and Lawrence is not unique to Willard. Variations of their stories played out in institutions across the country and continue to play out today. The young immigrant who needs support but has no family to advocate for him. The mother experiencing postpartum depression who is separated from her child. The musician whose talent is lost to a system that prioritizes compliance over creativity. These are not relics of the past. They are patterns that persist. And the suitcases, those 400 forgotten lives, are a warning. A warning that when care becomes warehousing, when institutions prioritize efficiency over humanity, and when society decides certain people are easier to forget than to help, the result is not just individual tragedy. It is collective failure. Willard operated for 126 years. In that time, more than 50,000 people passed through its gates. Most left, some recovered, many did not. And hundreds, like Dimitro, Anna, and Lawrence, spent decades inside, their lives reduced to routines, their identities erased by a system that saw them as problems to be managed rather than people to be helped. Their suitcases are all that remain. Objects that once held the promise of return. A change of clothes, a treasured possession, a reminder of who they had been before. Now they are memorials, to lives interrupted, to futures cancelled, to people who were forgotten, not because they were unloved, but because the systems designed to care for them failed. The Shadow of Willard endures because the questions it raises have not been answered, because the systems that enabled it have not been fully dismantled, because the tendency to forget, to store away people we find inconvenient, to close the door and move on, remains part of how we function as a society. Willard was not an anomaly. It was a symptom. And symptoms, when left untreated, return. This is where the story ends, not with solutions, not with closure, but with a reminder. The suitcases were found, the stories were told, the names were remembered. But the question remains, who are we forgetting now? And what will be left behind when we finally open the door?